Although we commonly use the phrase development, there's considerable debate over precisely what it means. In its most common usage, development is equated broadly with economic growth, and perhaps more precisely with a change in the structure of an economy. In this sense, the transition from a pre-industrial to an industrial economy, as occurred in England during the Industrial Revolution, is development. Today, the World Bank divides the world into three broad categories of development. High-income countries are those with a GDP per capita of more than $9,385. Middle-income countries are those with a GDP per capita of between $766 and $9,385. And low-income countries are those with a GDP per capita of less than $766. These categories leave out some important groups, such as the transition countries of the former Soviet bloc, and the high-income developing countries like the oil-rich Gulf states. But for the most part, the World Bank's classification provides us with a way of thinking about the features shared by developing countries. It also provides us with some insight into precisely what we mean by development. Development has traditionally been defined in economic terms as increasing the size of the economy. This is most commonly measured as gross domestic product per capita, which is the total value of goods and services produced by an economy in a given year, divided by the population of that economy. This figure is frequently, though often inaccurately, used to represent the quality of life in a particular country. But this measure has its limits. It's difficult to compare figures across countries. If we price GDP in local terms, we may have a more accurate figure, but we can't compare figures across countries. If we say, for example, that South Africa's GDP per capita is 71,499 rand, and India's GDP per capita is 81,703 rupee, what does that tell us? Not much. But if we convert the figures into dollars, we learn that South Africa's GDP per capita is $8,078 per person, while India's is $1,500 per person. Now we're in a better position to compare the two economies. A word of caution though, nominal currency conversions, which use official exchange rates, tend to understate the size of the economy in developing countries. This is known as the pen effect, and it comes into practice because developing countries tend to have lower costs of living than developed countries. To get around this, economists will sometimes use the purchasing power parity, or PPP, estimate. Rather than comparing economies using currency conversion rates, PPP compares the price of a basket of goods and uses that as the basis for exchange, leading to more accurate comparisons. Whenever you have a choice then, you should always opt for PPP GDP rather than nominal GDP. This chart gives you a sense of the difference between the two. Nominal GDP per capita is measured in the first column, and purchasing power parity GDP per capita is measured in the third column. Note the differences between the numbers by country. For most developed countries, and for many oil-rich states, nominal GDP per capita tends to overstate the size of the economy. Norway, for example, which is both a developed country and an oil-rich state, has a nominal GDP per capita nearly $40,000 larger than its real purchasing power parity GDP per capita. This suggests that the cost of living in Norway is high. By contrast, many developing countries, as reflected in the table here by South Africa, China, India, Bangladesh, and others, have a PPP GDP that is higher than their nominal GDP, suggesting that the currency is undervalued and reflecting the lower cost of living in each of those countries. For some, the difference is quite large. India's economy, for example, is effectively twice as large when measured using PPP GDP rather than nominal GDP. And sometimes it's difficult to be sure that the figures are even accurate. In his recent book on economic activity in Africa, economic historian Morton Jervin of Simon Fraser University in Canada noted that even setting aside the problems posed by conversion rates, there is a considerable disagreement about the relative rankings of the size of national economies. Looking at the ranking of African economies for the year 2000, for example, Jervin observes that the three different rankings, all of which purport to measure the same thing, the size of the national economy, arrive at quite different conclusions. They agree that the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly known as Zaire, is Africa's poorest country. But among the 10 poorest countries in Africa in the three rankings, only 6 consistently appear in all three rankings: the DR Congo, Sierra Leone, Niger, Burundi, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. There is better agreement about the 10 richest countries, but there is wide variation in the relative rankings across all categories. One ranks Guinea, for example, as Africa's 7th poorest economy, while another ranks it as its 10th richest, with an economy 5 times the size of the lower estimate. Mozambique is similarly ranked as the 8th poorest economy on the table, and the 12th richest in another, with an economy 10 times larger in one estimate than the other. And Liberia jumps 20 places in the rankings, moving from Africa's 2nd poorest in one ranking to a comfortable mid-ranked 22nd in another. Many other countries jump at least 10 places. All of this suggests that the use of gross domestic product per capita as a measure of development, particularly in the global south, should be greeted with a high degree of skepticism. GDP as a proxy for development also suffers from other shortcomings. GDP gives us no indication about the structure of an economy, only its size. What proportion of the economy is structured around manufacturing production? How much is based on the export of a single commodity? Most countries would prefer to have a diversified economy with some agriculture, some industry, and some service sector contributions. But many developing countries are disproportionately dependent on agricultural production and are frequently dependent on a single commodity or raw material for their export earnings. The International Monetary Fund currently lists Qatar as the world's wealthiest country, with a GDP per capita of almost $100,000. Yet the economy is almost entirely dependent on a single primary commodity, oil, for all of its export earnings and economic activity. Should Qatar be classified as a highly developed country, as a developing country? GDP doesn't give us an answer to this question. GDP also tells us nothing about the income distribution in a country. A society in which everyone is middle class, and a society in which there is extreme poverty accompanied by extreme wealth, would have equal levels of development in this respect. Again, Qatar is a telling example. While the per capita GDP is almost $100,000, foreign expatriates comprise almost 20% of the population of the country. Many of these people are guest workers from countries like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, who work as domestic laborers or doing manual labor tasks for low wages. Just knowing that Qatar has a high GDP per capita doesn't give us a sense of how the people in that country live. The Gini index, a measure of inequality, gives us a better sense of this. Here we note that many developing countries are highly unequal. This map shows Gini efficients from around the world. Note that most countries in red, the countries with the highest levels of inequality, are located in the global south. GDP does not generally include informal sector activities or unpaid labor. In developing countries, where much of the productive activity of the country takes place outside the formal economy, either illicitly or through the informal economy or as subsistence household production, this means that a large portion of economic activity remains unaccounted for. This exclusion carries gendered implications, as the work traditionally performed by women is disproportionately excluded from national accounts. Similarly, subsistence farming activities, which can occupy the productive labor of a majority of people in developing countries, remains excluded from the formal system of national accounts because such labor is unpaid and the output of the labor, farm crops, are generally consumed in the household rather than being sold on the formal market. As a result, the GDP for many developing countries often understates the actual level of economic activity in those countries. Finally, GDP fails to account for externalities, that is, for the costs of production that are not embodied in the price of a good. GDP is merely additive. When an oil well springs a leak in the Gulf of Mexico, the cost of cleaning that spill is added to the economy of the United States. Environmental damage is not deducted from the system of national accounts. This leads to a perverse outcome where natural or human-generated disasters can actually register as positives for the economy. Importantly, externalities can be positive or negative. Education carries positive externalities, as the broader benefits are not priced into the cost of education. This is why the state historically paid for education as a public good. Society benefits when its members are educated. Higher levels of education generally mean higher wages, which translate into broader tax bases for cities and countries. Similarly, a more educated workforce is more competitive globally and thus is more likely to attract investment. As a result, education is often cited as an example of a positive externality. But most of the time, we think of externalities as negative, that is, as costs associated with a particular good that are not priced into that good. The price of pollution that escapes my car's tailpipe as I drive down the street, for example, is not included in the price of the car I drive or in the gas I purchase. This is an example of a negative externality. And this is the real paradox. I doubt many people would associate oil spills with progress. Yet the use of gross domestic product as the primary measure of development runs the danger of doing precisely this, because all economic activity increases GDP. To that end, some economists argue we should rethink GDP and use something like the genuine progress indicator as a proxy for development instead. Unlike GDP, GPI removes the costs of externalities and the depletion of non-renewable resources from our economic activity. But according to the GPI, progress has been slow. The chart here shows that despite a steady increase in the GDP of the United States over the past 50 years, our GPI has remained largely unchanged. This suggests that our development has been unsustainable, something we'll return to later in the course.